So I watched this film before, as you know, and still I find it so utterly, utterly captivating and such an immersive experience. It's a beautiful film, and it captures so brilliantly some of the nuanced and complex ways in which all kinds of themes are transmitted in the daily interactions in family life from generation to generation. So I wanted to, first of all, congratulate you for such a beautiful, beautiful accomplishment, and to ask you, we see in empirical research that there is still transmission to the third generation, but the transmission is different. Its manifestations are different. And I guess that's what our conversation will touch upon this way or another. But can you first tell us a little bit about your own families, your own histories, and what brought you to be interested, and when did it start, your interest in the experience of your parents, the second generation? Because this movie is about actually the second generation still. Ruthie is a second generation, and her parents are somewhere in the 60s, right? Not that long after the end of the war. So please, whoever wants to start.
Thank you, Irit, as well. Thank you for your kind words, and I really appreciate it. And thanks for, I mean, it means a lot because your work is so deeply about this that it's hugely validating to hear you respond so strongly to it. Yeah, I mean, I grew up. I'm British. I grew up Jewish in the 80s in suburban North London, and I guess the trauma of the Holocaust was never far from view in my family. Particularly on my mother's side, my grandmother was born in Frankfurt, like Mrs. Hirth, and she thankfully wasn't in the camps, but she was on the run for most of the war as a girl, and migrated all over Europe to Antwerp, to the south of France, over the mountains into Italy, and ended up in Rome, pretending to be a Catholic in a convent where a couple of nuns knew her true identity. So, I began to absorb those stories around the Friday night table from a woman who, really didn't feel that this was a story worth telling. I mean, the kind of story that is, beyond anything that any of us thankfully may have to go through, to her felt like, a nothing. Oh, don't ask me about it. Oh, and I'm sure other people have heard that sense that their story is somehow, I later, I guess, realized that was the low self-esteem, in a way, the tinge, her sense of low self-esteem that came from the war was almost an expression of her survival. But I also, for me, growing up was also about the people that weren't there, the missing great uncles and aunts and cousins, people that I didn't know and will never know, and some of the some of the behavioral patterns. My grandmother, for instance, she lived a very comfortable life and a very happy life, but there were things that she brought with her, she would cross the road from uniformed people. She would avoid certain things. She didn't feel comfortable being in taxis, and who knows how much of that was just her and how much of that came from before. So, and then in the wider family, there were, I have distinct memories as a child of seeing, a relative roll up her sleeves as a nice tea party at my parents' house to pour some tea and see her concentration camp tattoo. And these incongruities, I think, were very striking, even as a young child. That, and then you connect the dots and you discover that that particular relative was in Auschwitz, and that she was, in selections to, we found a photograph of that very woman in selections that Mengele was undertaking, and these crazy juxtapositions of post-war settled life and the hell that people have gone through on across the spectrum of survival. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's what I'm absorbing growing up, and I think that the film is in part an attempt to show that aftermath and to explore what life was like. The war did not end in 1945. The Holocaust did not end in 1945. That it was an ongoing process, yeah.
I think that is a fantastic answer to my question, Mark, because it's exactly the way you say it. That thing that I speak about is the dual reality of the survivors and the children in their lives after the war, for the survivors, and for the children, obviously, who were born after the war to begin with. Yes, these two realities that continue to exist all the time, the reality related to the trauma and the reality of the tea party, the nice tea party at a relative's beautiful home in northern London. Yes, very different realities, incongruent with one another. One in which there are inconceivable things that happen, and I think it's captured so poignantly in that moment when the mother, who is kind of really not very emotionally available for the child in that moment, and really wants to go to sleep, and finally does say the thing about the GANEF, and the girl goes, "Is the GANEF coming here?" And mom's like, "No, no, no." The incongruity of these two realities and how those fragments are transmitted and deposited in and shatter really the reality of the simple reality of the girl, if she could have had one. Yeah. So what do you want to share with us about your background and what brought you to make this film?
Yes, thank you. Well, my grandparents on my father's side were both Holocaust survivors. My grandmother was one of 8 children, grew up right outside of Auschwitz, and 5 of those siblings died in the war. One of her baby nephew died, her parents, her grandparents, huge amounts of the family. And I honestly don't even remember the first time that I knew about these stories, because it was just so part of our upbringing. My middle name is Rivka, my brother's middle name is Mendel, and we knew we were named after those that perished, and we didn't know every detail, but we knew that something terrible had happened to her and her family from very young. But in terms of the details of what happened, she was very private about it and kept it really internally. And even my father growing up didn't know really what had happened to her, what camp she was in, anything. She really kept it to herself. And it was only when the third generation, my generation, had, book reports on the Holocaust that we were, or we were told, go interview a survivor. And, my grandmother was a survivor. So I interviewed my grandmother. Did she finally start telling us some of those details, being in various camps, being on the death march to Auschwitz, escaping and living in the woods. She found on the march to Auschwitz, they stopped for a night, and there was a hole that she saw in the gate where they were sleeping, and she wanted to grab her cousin, who was too afraid to go. So she ended up grabbing a stranger, and the 2 girls, escaped and were living in the woods and living, a very difficult few years trying to survive. And even with that, I know that there were still many details. She's passed now a few years ago, but that I still don't know, because she just wasn't ever able to bring herself to talk about them. I remember she was offered an opportunity, I think, to be part of Spielberg's Shoah project, and she didn't want to do that. Like, she just really held it very close to her chest. So, I know that my father says that he remembers her having nightmares and, things like that, but her way of dealing with it was very much keeping it inside. So I actually really identified when I read the script that Mark sent me, I identified that kind of take it in, go to sleep, take the pills, whatever, that felt very much like my grandmother. So I guess in certain ways, I actually also tend to avoid Holocaust subjects, because it feels, so painful for me. And, seeing anything to do with anti-Semitism, any of that just really freaks me out, because it just feels so close to home. But when Mark shared it with me, and Mark and I have had, had a good relationship before that, I just said, this feels fitting, and I wanted to do it for her.
Yeah, well, it's truly remarkable that that you did manage to do it, and it was a well worth effort. The outcome definitely, I hope, justifies the pain. And I think that what you touch upon is a very important piece. My very good friend and colleague, Dr. Dory Lau, who passed away a couple of years ago, was himself a child survivor, and he has he wrote a lot about his work with survivors, and he said that this knowledge that we have, and now you say the knowledge that you have, the third generation, it's not an informational knowledge. We don't know when we started knowing it. We don't know details. And in fact, as I often see in clients and friends that I meet, people don't often know actually very important pieces of the facts, and the timeline is all jumbled. It's really not a historical informational knowledge when we say we always knew, like you said, we always knew that something terrible happened to her and to her family. It's really an experiential knowledge of something that goes through and is being transmitted in these looks. And I think, Mark, by the way, the facial expressions of the woman who played Mrs. Hurst are remarkable in this way. She really did a beautiful job of transmitting a lot in the gaze, in the turn of the head, in the little expressions of the facial, muscles. This is how it's transmitted. It's not by facts or information about the Holocaust. And it's from the age of nothing,
right?
Younger than Ruthie, yes. So tell me a little bit more about what did it feel like for you to make this film, to try to communicate to the actress what your experience was like, and also if you would like to say something about why you chose to focus on the second generation experience rather than on your experience as the third generation.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it's set in, obviously it's set in the 60s, yes. and it felt to me very important somehow to show a survivor as a young woman. I think we are so used to seeing survivors as much older people, if at all, and increasingly, unfortunately, not around anymore. And somehow I think in a way, it lets us off the hook, because an older person makes a younger person feel, well, this was a long time ago. But to see that felt an important image, a woman in her 30s with a tattoo on her arm. And also, I think I was conscious that in order for this film dramatically to work, for the cleaner, the housekeeper to really not know what the context of this family was, it needed to be set before the time when survivors had begun to talk. Right. This is the time when, in the early 60s, I guess things are starting to shift because the Eichmann trial has, I think, just happened in the real world around this film. But the sense that society had not yet validated or not even really truly acknowledged what had happened to these people meant that those people were inhibited from speaking. And I became aware, even researching it, that in that period, even couples, husbands and wives, who had both survived, didn't really talk to each other about it. It was such a shame, even that you put it behind you. And in the context of a world where there's much less counseling, available. You know, a lot of those pieces felt important, so it needed to be set then. And otherwise, I think later, sort of post Schindler's List, people are, you know, my grandmother is sitting at the Friday night table, and her story is being sort of teased from her by, you know, astounded grandchildren who are wanting to know what on earth their grandmother, what happened to her. So yeah, I think that was very important in terms of the setting. And I guess also, I mean, Ruthie, the little girl, is not my mother, and if she's watching, she may be watching. I'm not suggesting for a second that it's specifically her, but you know, I'm very aware, for instance, with my mother, that, you know, her commitment to, she's been very committed to the memorializing and commemorating. And actually, you know, you were talking about information being gathered in pieces and sometimes unchronologically. Well, my mum has really pulled our family history together in real chronology and is constantly looking for the fragments and the missing pieces of the jigsaw. And in some ways, I think that desire is connected to memorial in a very political sense. Like my mother is very, very aware that there is a counter narrative, that this did not happen, or that in some ways this is some crazy story told by Jews in quotation marks to have some, you know, create some sort of get something. And so actually, I think the pulling together of these stories for her is a way of fighting. You know, this happened. It's not just happened to our family, but it happened. And with the I guess unfortunately they're not being direct first generation survivors to say that. We need, you know, that information. Why is that relevant to Ruthie? I'm not entirely sure, but I do sense in Ruthie something. Just aware of how my mother maybe had, you know, received that my mother, as a second generation survivor, you know, internalized something and sought to counter it in some way through the work in her life. And Ruthie is very different because her journey in the film is from love to fear. She moves from physical connection to this woman that she loves, this housekeeper who she plays with, to being locked in a cupboard, unable to be touched by her and fearing her very movement. And so for Ruthie, I think the journey of the film is really, I hope is clear, is about the impact of trauma on people, on relationships, that it is constricting, and that it stops you connecting. It's designed to divide you, you know. So anyway, those are sort of two long answers to questions. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
well, I think you've answered my question again beautifully, because first of all, starting with the last point you made, is you know, some of my colleagues, Shmotkin and Shrira from Israel, spoke about the creation of a hostile world script or world scenario, which is what you're talking about, that it installs these insecurities and these suspicious expectations about what people are like, who people are like, and it destroys the capacity for that open-hearted and joyful connection that she had with the cleaner before, right? And that, of course, gets generalized to other relationships, except you showed it so beautifully in this particular dyad of the girl and the cleaner. Yes, I think it was brilliant actually to go back to the survivors as young people, because even though there are some movies, older movies, that show survivors as young people, like Sophie's Choice and other ones, they were done a long time ago. And for the generations growing up today, the survivors are mainly these older people. And like you said, that makes it a little bit too far away. It's easier for us to really grasp something when it's about people who are more our age. So it's very important that you actually went back to people who are like your age, for the young people of today, yeah, and before the cultural context changed. and made it so much more open. So you are also speaking about that, the importance of the attitudes in the wider social context to how people can deal with their trauma. So maybe Suri and you would like to speak a little bit about that. I know that's very important to you in terms of the impact of the film.
Sorry, the question is just about how it affects the wider world of trauma.
So how the attitudes, what you would like actually to communicate through the movie, through the film, about the importance of the attitudes around the trauma survivors, the wider cultural context to how people can deal with their trauma.
Yeah. When we made the film, obviously we have our own personal connection to World War II and the Holocaust specifically, but we really wanted to speak to a larger audience who would understand trauma. Trauma is not unique to the Jewish people. I mean, we have a lot of it, but it's not unique to us. And there are a lot of, different groups of people that have been through major traumas. And actually, it was funny when Mark and I were opening up the production bank account, we had a woman who was speaking to us. We were telling her about the film, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I can't remember what was her. Do you remember what her background was, Mark?"
She was from Pakistan.
Yeah. So she was just talking about her father and about how this would really speak to her father and the things that her family had been through. So we always kind of had an eye towards that wider worldview of that trauma can affect anybody, and the impact of that over generations is not small. I know, Mark, you had been speaking when we chatted before to Irit about how that might impact on politics and about decisions that world leaders make, about we have to think about the long-term effects, not just the immediate people that have been going through this trauma. The effects continue on for generations, and that is something to be taken into consideration.
Yeah,
Mark.
I don't want to make any claim that this film is, seeking to correct great things and great terrible things in the world. But first of all, it is a domestic, it is a domestic film, and the detail in it is trying to express that everyone in that film is compromised by this traumatic experience. Everyone from the housekeeper to the child to the mother, everyone is. Their behavior is compromised by it. This is what trauma does. It changes the behavior of people without those people really even knowing it's happening. It's instinctive. It creates mistrust and division and disconnection. But yeah, as Suri was saying, I also feel like beyond the specifics of the Holocaust, I do feel enraged when I see any kind of systemic violence against the community, as I'm sure we all do, but just the kind of the sort of almost willful ignorance of governments who maybe enact that kind of violence. The problem does not resolve, the damage does not wane away in 5 years. It goes on and on and on. Every time, some violence is launched against a group of people, that family, that community's behavior will be reshaped for generations to come. And the fact that we don't address that in the wider discussion, I think is deliberate. I think it is deliberately quiet, and it's not a very, dare I say, a sexy thing to discuss the kind of domestic implications of violence for the generations that follow, but it's also inconvenient for politicians to discuss it because it makes the decision to go to enact violence, even without discussing it, becomes easier to do it. It liberates people because they don't have to think about the kind of the long-term view of what they're about to do. And you see it in our community and many communities, unfortunately.
Right. And in fact, this concept that the generational damage, it goes actually further than the first generation even, took a long time to be acknowledged, even by mental health professionals. Yes, It took a long time to acknowledge intergenerational transmission to the children of survivors, which we now see not only in Holocaust families, but in many other more recent trauma-exposed groups, and in descendants of other trauma survivors generations later. It's truly, yeah. So as we have only 3 more minutes or so before we would like to open it for the questions and comments from the audience, could each of you tell me what would you hope to communicate to the 4th generation and to the generations that come? Mark, you have a new baby, 4th generation joined the family, yes, and others. What would you like to communicate further from your experiences as descendants of trauma survivors, and what would you not want to communicate further?
I'll speak. I feel like obviously I think remembering the Holocaust is something that is very important to me personally. I know Mark mentioned his mom is very active, and I know it's important to Mark as well. And that is something that we do have to continue as the generation of survivors are essentially all gone. It's important to keep that conversation going. And I would extend it to say as well that using that knowledge of what happened to us as Jewish people to also have empathy and be proactive about what else is happening in the world. I know, Irit, you said also on a call that we had before that that our generation, one of the hallmarks is like this social justice and wanting to put that forward, that it shouldn't happen to anyone else. And I do think, remembering our own history, making sure that other people remember our own history, but also being proactive about making sure that the rest of the world is not being put into any type of suffering that we've gone through. And yeah, what about you, Mark?
No, I mean, all of that, but and I also think, I think we just have to acknowledge that it's in us, and that we could transmit it, and we just have to be mindful of what we're transmitting. That it's not, people don't consciously transmit it. It's in the stories we tell about who we are. And whether it's telling how we tell the story of, if we observe Pesach, at the Seder, how do we frame that story, can be affected by the experience of the Holocaust. And when you're telling that story to your son or your daughter, it is possible to frame it in a way that is frankly, terrifying to them. And we just have to consider what we're saying in those moments, and how easy it is for that young person to internalize a story that's being used as a kind of analogy for now, or for what happened to our family, and how we want them to, or do we want them to be so scared that they are inhibited about connection, or do we, how do we handle that conversation? I think, and I don't have the answers. I just think it's just, let's be aware that it's with us, and we have to tread carefully and self-awarely, if so, with self-awareness.
And perhaps have more conversations like this as well, and to learn, because, thinking about that, my kids are very young, as are yours, Mark, but so we haven't had to like brace those conversations yet. But I would love to hear from someone like Irit before I do that, and just hear what might be the best way to do that, because it is a really tricky thing to do. We want to keep the generations remembering, but also, not be passing down such trauma that we can't move forward and be healthy people psychologically.
Right. So before we stop, I just want to tell you that I am amazed at the perceptiveness and insightful and really rich discussion that you offered us. And I want to say that as someone who has very young children still, we will continue speaking about something that I want to share with you, but I'll just mention the work of a colleague of mine, Beatrice Beebe from Columbia University, and a picture book of mother-infant interactions, which she created based on her work with the mothers, among which some of them I worked with in the aftermath of September 11th, mothers who gave birth to babies after their husbands were killed. And obviously they were in grief and in mourning and in acute trauma. So the thing that you are trying to stress, Mark, is so important, that survivors communicate this, descendants of survivors communicate this. We have to know that we do. And it's communicated not only by the stories, it's also communicated by what people tried not to say. It was also communicated. And the question is of self-awareness and of being able to process it's not just awareness, it's being able to process our own trauma so that it's in a better place. And for that, we need the acknowledgement and the support of the environment around us. We cannot do it alone. And that is why these conversations on the public arena in various ways are so important, because survivors cannot just by being aware of their trauma contain it. They need to process it. They need the support of the environment around them. So thank you so very, very much for this jewel of a movie, of a film, and let's open it up to the audience comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We read. There's a couple comments and questions from audience members that relate to Ruthie. The young actress did an amazing job. Can you share a little bit about what it was like working with her in that role?
Yeah, I mean, she was amazing. I mean, she was 5 when we auditioned her, and 6 when we shot the film. And you know, I'm naive enough as a filmmaker to have written a film, centered around a 6-year-old girl. And when I arrived on set, I was like, I really was confronting the worry that, she might not understand. In film, you don't shoot in sequence. So, for a 6-year-old, 5-6-year-old girl to play moment to moment and shoot in out of order, I was really worried it would throw her. And she'd only done some modeling, and I just said to her, I tried to explain it, and she's like, sure, yeah, there's an editor, and they just reshuffle it back in order. And I was just like, okay, we're gonna be okay. She was wonderful, and her energy was kind of mischievous and sparky, and sometimes, like, as a 5-year-old can be, or 6-year-old, crazy on set. But then when she was in front of camera, as you can see from what she's doing, she's really an actor. She's processing thought, she's playing in the present moment, and she is talking over, talking to those. I didn't feel like I was having to move her from A to B to C. It was a person. There was a character really in the room.
Yeah.
She was wonderful. Yeah, she was doing some method acting there. Do you remember? She was like, I have to feel, this is how I felt sad when I did something, lost my cat or something. Do you remember? She's
yeah,
amazing, brilliant.
Yeah, brilliant.
Carrie in the audience comments on the scene of Ruthie in her room surrounded by toys and says perhaps her mother gives her all those toys because she knows she can't be there for her enough. Is that what you guys were going for, that sense of overcompensation?
Maybe I hadn't consciously thought of that, but that would be absolutely right. I mean, the mother is unable to properly interact and doesn't, needs her daughter to be somewhere else. I think on a storytelling level, we needed to make the contrast in her room between the toys being there and the toys being locked away when the cleaner comes in, very striking, but also more than anything, I think she's a girl. We needed to show she was a girl of imagination, and that her room was like, and when we first dressed that room with all the toys, it was very neat, like almost like a Victorian toy box sort of thing, dollhouse. And I just messed it up. This girl is not. She's dinosaurs are fighting Barbie dolls, and everything is crashed around the room. There's been a war, there's been a battle. So that we could understand that this is a girl of imagination, and a girl who could misconstrue things.
Yeah.
Uh,
Misconstrue or create her own connections between
Yes.
different things.
Yeah, exactly.
Nikki asks, besides working with Ruthie, as you mentioned, what was the biggest challenge in the filmmaking process?
Question.
I-
It was
Go on, sorry.
no, well, certainly working with Ruthie, just in terms of not just because she's young and you have to communicate things, but because from a production standpoint, we had very few hours we were legally allowed to work with her. So our schedule was like very tight, and we were shooting things up until like the last second, and then a few times asking people to stay over because we needed to work around her, what we were allowed to do. So that was very difficult. But aside from that, we had a really fantastic crew. Sorry, Mark, did you want to add?
No, I mean, for me, it's the first original film that as I say, I've directed some things before, but it's the first time I've written something original and personal and made it. And I think for me, that almost the biggest challenge was just committing to making it, writing it in the first place, just getting over, those inhibitions about writing, and then, like going on the journey, like really doing it, sending a script to Surrey into a 3.5 day shoot. Yeah.
I know that there are some audience members who missed the film at the beginning or would like to watch it again. What are your plans for wider distribution, and where can people see it?
It's a great question. We're going to be up on a platform called Amuleto. Maybe we can write it somewhere I could put it
in the chat.
In the chat, yeah. But it's a short film screening platform. It'll be up from the end of this week for about a month. So you'll have a month that you can rewatch it there, and then we'll see somewhere else possibly. But that's where we'll be. Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark, and we'll make sure to include that information in a follow-up email tomorrow as well.
Fantastic.
There's an interesting question here from Sophia, who says, Irit, you had asked Mark and Suri a question about what they want to transmit and don't want to transmit to future generations. How would you answer that question?
Well, I think that what we actually see in studies, and research about the third generation is accumulating these days. We see some interesting trends, some of which are a little bit worrisome. We see that there is a transmission of elevated anxiety and depressive symptoms. And in fact, where we would expect it to get diluted from generation to generation, as for example, the depression and anxiety symptoms were lesser amongst the second generation in comparison to the survivor generation, but still higher than our peers who are not Holocaust related. We expected maybe or hoped for the same in the third generation. However, we actually see an increase in anxiety and depression in the third generation. And I think it has to do with some of the not positive aspects of the geopolitical, social, cultural environment that the third generation has grown up in, relative to the reasonably safe and peaceful times that we grew up in, the second generation. So obviously we would like to not transmit further some of the anxiety, the depressive tendencies, the hostile worldview, the suspiciousness, the fear of the other. We wouldn't want to transmit it. And what we would want to transmit is some of the resiliencies, the hope, the ability to hang on to one's values and to optimism and to hope and to develop very successful adaptation during trauma and after trauma, to be able to move forward despite trauma, the empathy and the ability to feel and to act against other people's suffering just because we are the descendants of survivors. All of those things we would like to transmit. And it's a very tricky balance. it's a very tricky balance, how to achieve that, how to choose the jewels that we want from this legacy and move them forward without burdening the third, the fourth, the fifth generation with some of the trauma. Yeah.
Thank you, Irit. And can you also clarify the name of that children's book you mentioned? There's some questions about that.
Yes, so I can also put it in the whatever you would like to send afterwards, Ari. It is something called the Picture Book of Mother-Infant Interactions, and it is by Beatrice Beebe and her colleagues. I can send you the exact name afterwards.
Thank you.
And also, by the way, also for those of you who want, if you Google Beatrice Beebe on YouTube, there ought to be a movie there by someone whose name I'm blanking on right now, a movie about Beatrice Beebe's work that shows a lot of these principles. I think for people with young children to see the way that our micro interactions, as we call it, are perceived by them and communicate a lot to infants as young as 4 months old is a very teaching moment. It's well worth watching.
Thank you, Irit. We're
Sure.
just hitting the end of the hour, so let's close with this question for Suri and Mark. What are you working on next?
I am trying to, I am trying to write, I think there is a feature version of this short, whether or not, and I'm working on a few ideas around that. But I'm writing a couple of other feature ideas. I'm developing a TV show, and I'm writing a play as well, which I've never done before for a theatre in London. So, and I can't really talk about any of them, but that's the outline. That's my headline news.
Wow.
Yes, I wish you could speak about them because they're great. So I've got a film production company called Same Name Productions, and we are developing feature films and a couple of television series as well. And I've got a short film that I am developing as well with another director. There's a lot on. I can just say one project. I mean, none of them are Jewish related, but maybe another thing will come up for me at some point. But one film that is about a woman in England who her house is meant to be demolished for a roundabout to be built, and she decides that she's going to fight the council, and of course she loses because they're more powerful than her, and so she ties her kerchief under her chin and she takes down her entire house by herself, moves it 30 miles north, and then rebuilds it all by herself, she's in her early 60s and she did it until her mid 80s. She's like an incredible woman based on a true story. So that's one. I mean, there are other things, but that's one.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So good stuff.
Very good stuff. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for moderating.
So much.
Such an honor, really.
Yeah, it's been a real privilege. Thank you for, I'm so pleased the film resonates and that we could share it with you today. Yeah.
And thank you to the museum for hosting us. Really, it was very, very special experience for us to be able to be in a home that feels really appropriate for the film. So thank you.
Pleasure is ours. Bravo to Mark Rosenblatt, Suri Ellerton, and the whole team behind GANEF on this wonderful short film, which is Oscar qualified. At the end of this week, the film will be available for streaming on Amuleto, which we'll send out a link to. And starting tomorrow, you'll be able to access a recording of this panel discussion on the museum's website and YouTube channel. You can join us for upcoming programs and support the museum's work on our website, the links in the Zoom chat. Once again, great thanks to all of you, and we wish everyone good luck.
Thank you very much, Ari.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.